Okay, welcome everyone to the 7th lecture in the Humanities Research Centre's Work That Shaped the World public lecture series for 2022. I want to begin by acknowledging the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the land the ANU is built upon. And today we're going to be talking about The Prophet by Kahlil Gibran. Now, in an essay about the changing role of poetry in American life in the 20th century, Robert Pinsky lists 3 past poetry publishing phenomena: Charles Bukowski, Allen Ginsberg, and Kahlil Gibran. We'll leave Bukowski aside for the day, but Gibran and Ginsberg actually sit quite nicely together. Gibran was embraced by the counterculture 30 years after he died. Ginsberg was actually there. Both were heirs to the Romantic tradition and the Transcendentalists. Both engaged in a bit of self-orientalizing. But Ginsberg was not a fan of Gibran. He described his poetry as so unreferential, you don't know what he's talking about. Gibran wrote crystal ball poetry for Ginsberg that allows you to gaze into it and see whatever you want to see. But that helps explain why The Prophet has sold 10 million copies since 1923, or over 10 million copies since 1923. Now, in her foreword to the 2019 edition published by Penguin Classics, Rupi Kaur writes, decade after decade, The Prophet reinvents itself to become what readers require. So it's still a crystal ball. Now, Rupi Kaur was an inspired choice to write that introduction. She's a much mocked so-called Instagram poet. She has millions of fans who find her inspirational and about as many detractors who claim she's just terrible, which sounds quite familiar. Suhail Bushrui, one of the leading Gibran scholars, noted the irreconcilable attitudes of those who have deified Gibran and those who have dismissed him as a mere populist. And Rupi Kaur reads The Prophet in this crystal ball manner through her father's story of immigration. And I'll say a few things about Gibran's immigrant story too. And Kaur links The Prophet to her father's struggles against an emotionally restrictive masculinity. For those moments when his words couldn't express the weight of what he endured, Kaur wrote, he allowed Kahlil Gibran's The Prophet to do the talking for him. Now, Kahlil Gibran sometimes allowed Kahlil Gibran's Prophet to do the talking for him. He struggled to live up to the ideals of love and simplicity that he preached in his poem. Like another fan of Gibran that we'll meet, Rupi Kaur has gifted dozens of copies of The Prophet to friends, amazed at how a book with very specific origins, written by an immigrant from Lebanon in New York, can have universal appeal. The answer she suggests is the book's simple message. Life is difficult, but the universe has equipped us with the tools to overcome those difficulties. And I'll suggest that this notion of a benign but personal universe, or an undiscriminating God of no particular religion, has become the dominant spiritual logic of the West. So I'm going to begin with an overview of Gibran's life. Spoiler alert, he drank himself to death at the age of 48. Then we'll look at the text of The Prophet itself, its message, its language, its influences. I'll then say something about the reception of The Prophet over the decades, from early negative reviews to selling 4 million copies by the end of the 1960s. We'll also meet its most famous fan. Now, Gibran is born as Gibran Kahlil Gibran in 1883 in a village called Bishara in Mount Lebanon, which was then part of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the mountain is a recurring theme in Gibran's artwork. Many mature Gibran compositions feature a looming mountain in the background, with human figures playing out symbolist spiritual dramas in the foreground. But Gibran last sees Mount Lebanon as a teenager. Now, the cathedral you can see here in the middle picture, the oldest photo I could find of Bishara, it was built after Gibran's death. It's a Maronite Catholic village. The church played an important role in the life of the village. Now, Gibran's born into the Maronite church. His mother's father was a Maronite priest, but Gibran rejected organized religion. He was very critical of it from his teenage years. When he was on his deathbed, he actually, he refused the offer of last rites and he denied being Catholic. In the end, though, he did actually get not one, but multiple Maronite funerals, both in the US and in Lebanon. Now, Gibran would later claim that he grew up amid fabulous wealth, the grandson of the richest man in Lebanon. He also started a rumor that he was actually born in India. But in reality, his family were pretty precariously middle class. This painting by Daoud Korm, who taught Gibran briefly, it's from Beirut, where Gibran studied for several years. And I think that's when Daoud Korm taught him, unless that was just some puffery to lift up the price of the painting at auction. But it gives you a sense of the world, I think, that Gibran was born into. His father, also called Kahlil Gibran, was a tax collector and a landowner, but a heavy drinker, and he was prone to violence. Aside from their shared love of coffee, cigarettes, and arak, Gibran Jr. was very different. He was frail, short, well-dressed, basically what you'd expect of a bohemian poet. Now, Gibran wrote, in a lot of his early writings are about the exploitation and the suffering of the poor in Lebanon. And we have to say that his father was a part of that system. He just wasn't very good at it. So the family suffers financial insecurity, and they leave his father behind in 1895, and the family emigrate. So his mother, his older half-brother, and his two sisters. They considered South America, where a lot of Arabs were going at that time, but they settled on Boston, where he had relatives. Now, I find this part of Gibran's story in a way quite inspiring, because it's so typical. It's so typical of not just Lebanese of that period, but people throughout, the Mediterranean and Europe at that time. So when Gibran arrives on a summer day at Ellis Island with his mother and three siblings in 1895, there could have been quite literally 1,000 other families just like them. In so many ways, Gibran is iconic and unusual, but at that point, there's nothing unusual about them at all. They're one impoverished family emigrating, looking for a better life amid literally 1,000 others. So the Boston that he arrives in 1895, 3/4 of the population are immigrants, and they rub shoulders with like old New England money. The consequence is a proliferation of charities, usually run by women. And Gibran falls immediately into this charitable network. He's very bright, he's very creative, he falls into this charitable network, and that sets up a pattern really for the rest of his life. It's only late in his life that he weans himself off financial reliance on female benefactors. He also relies on the labor of women in his family, especially his sister Mariana, who for many years works and cooks and cleans for him, giving him time to be a genius. So Gibran is an artistic prodigy, and through these charitable networks of Boston, he's brought to the attention of Fred Hollanday, part-time photographer, full-time eccentric. He's impressed by Gibran's art, and he takes photos of Gibran in costumes, as he did with many other young men. Now, we wouldn't accept this sort of thing today, but we have to say that Day was the formative influence on Gibran. He gives him a sense of identity beyond a kid from a village living in an immigrant slum in Boston. Now, Sahel Bushrui writes bohemian elements of Boston, and look at Day here, he's pretty much a bohemian element if there ever was one. They were dabbling with Orientalism, Bushrui writes, against a backdrop of Turkish carpets, water pipes, fezzes, and Burne-Jones paintings. And this inspires Day to imagine Gibran as a kind of philosopher prince, and Gibran seems to sort of take this on board. Day also introduces Gibran to literature and art, to Walt Whitman, William Blake, the Romantics, they're all lifelong influences. The idea of the poet as a prophet, of subjective experience as the basis for truth, the love of nature, opposition to laws and institutions. This is the spirit of the Romantics. They also introduce us into the work of William Morris and the rest of the pre-Raphaelites and their love of the medieval. So he realizes that you can look forward by looking backwards, so to speak. Now we see here a page from William Morris's illustrated edition of Edward Fitzgibbon's translation of Omar Khayyam. And Robert Pinsky, who I mentioned at the start, explains that before World War II, it wasn't unusual for even lower middle class Americans like Pinsky's family, to be able to recite bits of Omar Khayyam from the Fitzgerald translation. So it gives you a sense of the artistic world that even then Gibran was becoming a part of in the United States. Now, I have to say that the influence of Blake is really thorough. It's so, how thorough? Well, in later years when he meets Mary Haskell, who becomes his fiance for a while, his informal editor. And through her, he discovers theosophy with its belief in reincarnation. Haskell and Gibran decide that, obviously, Kahlil Gibran is the reincarnation of William Blake. That's how influential. They decide, and this is a perfectly sensible line of argument if you're a Boston Bohemian in the 1900s, Blake was reincarnated as Dante Gabriel Rossetti, a pre-Raphaelite, so we've got that connection as well. And then Rossetti is reincarnated as Gibran. So he claims a literal artistic heritage in that way. Gibran later claimed also that Rodin called him the Blake of the 20th century, but we don't have any evidence for that. Gibran, one of his flaws, we all have them, of course, one of his flaws was that he was prone to make shit up. Now, Day also serves as a patron to Gibran, and we think that he possibly pays him to go and study in Beirut for a few years. Now, when Gibran comes back in 1902, so he's 18, 19 years old. In that year, his mother dies, his brother dies, his older half-brother dies, and one of his younger sisters dies. And this is a lot of tragedy for anyone, particularly a 19-year-old kid, basically. But in 1902, he strengthens his relationship with Josephine Peabody, who is a writer herself. She's some years older than him, about 5 years older. And she becomes the first of 3 women that he idealizes over his lifetime, while he sometimes carries on affairs with other women. He places these 3 women on pedestals as spiritual ideals. They're not real people. Now, the other 2 women who get this goddess treatment in later years are Mary Haskell and May Zaida. He never actually meets May. She's another famous Lebanese poet, but they never meet. They just correspond by writing because Gibran never goes back to the Middle East after 1902. Now, Mary Haskell, she's the most important woman in his life. She comes from money, from old Confederate money. She runs a private school, and she's part of Boston's radical subcultures. She would love Dorothy Day, who's part of the Catholic worker movement, the subject of our next Works That Shape the World lecture in 2 weeks' time. I think they would have a lot to talk about. Dorothy Day, a Catholic anarchist, maybe a saint, 2 weeks' time. So she's part of the Bohemian subculture. She supports the Wobblies, this sort of radical trade union movement. She becomes Gibran's patron for many years. She pays for him to go study in Paris in 1908. Now, initially, their relationship, it seems kind of maternal because Haskell, she's 10 years older than Gibran. Like I said, she comes from money. She's very well educated. She's a graduate of Wellesley. She runs this private school. But after Gibran returns from Paris, they do become engaged, but they don't actually end up marrying. She introduces, she's so influential in so many ways. She introduces Gibran to theosophy. She helps with his exhibitions, and she works informally as his editor, including on The Prophet. She checked over all his English publications, making changes, but not really radical stylistic changes. If you don't like the way Gibran writes, that's down to Gibran. Don't blame Mary. Now, The Prophet, you see the way we make that slip between poets and prophet. I was about to call it the Gibran, but the prophet is published in English. It's written in English. It's published in English in 1923. But Gibran's earliest publications, there he is looking very Byronic. His earliest publications from the mid-1900s are in Arabic. He has two short story collections described by his friend Mikhail Naima on the other end of the screen here as tirades against the despotism of certain social orders, particularly marriage. One of the stories is called Kahlil the Heretic. So he's part of this network of Lebanese writers in New York, where he lives from 1912 with Naima. He's another key figure. But in the late 1910s, he starts publishing collections of ironic parables in English, The Madman in 1918 and The Forerunner in 1920. I won't say anything about his other writings other than a couple of real quick things. He did publish one critically celebrated book in English. We'll see the Prophet get sort of mixed reviews, but one uniformly celebrated English language book in 1928, 5 years after the Prophet, was called Jesus, Son of Man. And it's a much better book. It's a brilliant book, and you get real people on the page. And it's remarkable that he can flesh out real characters, real sort of suffering characters, living characters in just a few pages. Because you don't really get that in Gibran's other writing. He's not really interested, and we'll talk about this, but he publishes Jesus, Son of Man in 1928, which is universally praised. The other point I want to say about his other publications is he has a much better scholarly and critical reputation for his Arabic language publications than his English writings. And I'll say a little bit more about that later on. But Muhsin al-Musawi, in a book about Arabic poetry, describes Gibran as rescuing the Arabic language from the grandiosity that accompanies dying aristocracies. It's very different from the reputation that his English language writing has. One critic remarked that he doesn't so much imitate the King James Bible as Sir Laurence Olivier's melodramatic 12-album recording of the King James Bible, but don't take my word for it. We'll jump right into the text. Al-Mustafa, the chosen and the beloved, who was adorned unto his own day, had waited 12 years in the city of Orphalese for his ship that was to return and bear him back to the isle of his birth. And when he entered into the city, all the people came to meet him, and they were crying out to him as with one voice. And there came out of the sanctuary a woman whose name was Al-Mitra, and she was a seeress. It was she who had first sought and believed in him when he had been but a day in the city. Prophet of God in quest of the uttermost, long have you searched the distances for your ship. Yet this we ask ere you leave us, that you speak to us and give us of your truth. Speak to us of love. And he raised his head and looked upon the people, and there fell a stillness upon them. And with a great voice he said, when love beckons to you, follow him, though his ways are hard and steep. And we're often racing after that. That's the setup for Al-Mustafa to deliver 26 sermons on different topics. Later sections are begun with, an astronomer said, master, what of time? And a poet said, speak to us of beauty. Now, this is typical Gibran because, as I said, with the exception of Jesus, Son of Man, I might have mentioned it's a better book, he's not that interested in characterization, Gibran. There's a kind of an irony here, I think, because he's concerned with people suffering, and he is an individualist. He's a romantic. He's concerned with the individual experience and so on. He wants Al-Mustafa to address ordinary people's concerns, to be the voice that they all experience but can't articulate. But Gibran's concerned with people as individuals, but he doesn't depict people really as individuals in his books. In his books, people are vehicles for his ideas. Now, the first substantive spiritual saying here in the book, when love beckons to you, follow him, though his ways are hard and steep, that's also classic Gibran. Even in those earliest publications that I just mentioned before, the Arabic stories about defying convention and enduring suffering for love, you get that romantic call coming through as well. Now, I'm going to mention three formal influences and three sort of specific influences on the prophet. The first you might have perhaps have picked up on. It's Nietzsche's "Thus Spake Zarathustra." Now, in 1908, when he's in Paris, thanks to Mary Haskell, Gibran reads Nietzsche. The setup of the two texts is identical: a prophet in exile preaching to the people of a city. When Zarathustra was 30 years old, he left his home and went into the mountains. There he enjoyed his spirit and solitude, and for 10 years did not weary of it. But at last his heart changed. When Zarathustra arrived at the nearest town which adjoineth the forest, he found many people assembled in the marketplace. And Nietzsche said, "I teach you the Superman." Much easier. So Suhail Bushrui, he says that it's Nietzsche's form, not his formulations, that inspires Gibran. And he points out the fact that the last reference to Nietzsche in Gibran's letters is 1913, 5 years before he starts working on the prophet while staying in the mansion of a different eccentric heiress, Mary Tudor Garland. So Mikhail Naima sort of half seriously jokes maybe Gibran forgot the plot of Zarathustra when he adopted it for the prophet. So Naima writes, Nietzsche takes for a mouthpiece a prophet called Zarathustra, Gibran a prophet called Al-Mustafa. Zarathustra is Nietzsche in another form, Al-Mustafa Gibran under a borrowed name. And Naima lists connections between Al-Mustafa's story and Gibran. So he says Orphalese is New York. He says that, Al-Mitra wants to go back to the Isle of his birth. For Gibran, that's Lebanon. And he says also that Al-Mitra, she who first sought and believed in Al-Mustafa, is actually Mary Haskell, his first and most sort of devoted kind of follower. A second interesting influence is the Book of Khaled by Amin Rouhani, the first Arab-American novel published in 1911. And Gibran illustrated it, as you can see here. It's a strange book. It's a semi-autobiographical novel about immigration written in English, but it includes long passages of what these days we might call Gibranisms. Oh, my brothers, there is but one star in this vague dusky sky above us. Each of you, oh, my brothers, can make it light his own hut, warm his own heart, guide his own soul. Another influence is Job, the language and form of Job. So Gibran wrote, and I really like this little piece he wrote. Poets ought to listen to the rhythm of the sea. That's the rhythm in Job and in all the magnificent parts of the Old Testament. It is then said right off again a little differently. And that's like the waves of the sea. You know how a big wave rolls in, then some of the pebbles roll back again with a smaller noise. And we see this in a repetition of language and argument. For example, in a section on marriage, you're born together and together you shall be forevermore. You shall be together when the white wings of death scatter you. You shall be together even in the silent memory of God. And then in Job, canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put a hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn? Will he make many supplications unto thee? Will he speak soft words unto thee? Will he make a covenant with thee? Now, another influence that gets mentioned in commentaries on the prophet is Sufism. Suhail Bushrui claims the prophet's message is Sufi to its very core, with the ideas of the unity of the body and soul and a greater divine unity. On the other hand, Kahlil Gibran, who's a Lebanese poet and literary scholar, author of, I think, one of the earliest and critical studies of Gibran, very critical study of Gibran. He questions this Sufi influence. He says Mikhail Naima sort of mentions it in his early biography of Gibran, this idea of the Sufi influence. But then when Howie interviews Naima, he can't explain where this Sufi influence comes from. He can't elaborate on it. It might be, and I think it might be the case that there's a desire to read Sufism into the prophet to make it less American, maybe. So the idea of cosmic unity, you say that comes from Sufism rather than, New England transcendentalism. And it sort of ticks the box of religious toleration as well, which we'll see is important for representations of Gibran. So the rhythms of Job aren't the only biblical features of the language. Most basically, because it's a book about a prophet, there's a prophetic antithesis throughout the book. So you have common sense, and then there's the prophetic speech that turns that common sense upside down. That's the most in the English language, at least, the best example of this prophetic antithesis is the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard it said, "Love thy neighbor, hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies." And we do get 4 "but I says" in the text, most clearly in the section of work, which emphasizes an expressive work ethic against both a sort of an aristocratic work ethic, that work is awful, but also a sort of Protestant work ethic, that work is good when it's sort of joyless personal sublimation of everything into joyless labor. Then a parent said, "Speak to us of work," and he answered saying, "Always you have been told that work is a curse and labor a misfortune." That's, I think, against that sort of aristocratic work ethic he would have encountered in Lebanon. "But I say to you that when you work, you fulfill a part of earth's furthest dream. Work is love made visible. And if you cannot work with love, but only with distaste, it is better that you should leave your work and sit at the gate of the temple and take alms of those who work with joy. For if you break bread with indifference, if you bake bread with indifference, you bake a bitter bread that feeds but half man's hunger. And if you sing those angels and love not the singing, you muffle man's ears to the voices of the day and the voices of the night." So Al-Mustafa and Gibran, they're not turning upside down any one particular religion or one particular religious teaching, although the book contradicts pretty much all of them. The target's presented as the common sense of the day. And so the prophetic antithesis is this sort of romantic emphasis on freedom, love, and self-expression. For example, you have this passage on marriage, popular at weddings. "You shall be together even in the silent memory of God, but let there be spaces in your togetherness, and let the winds of the heavens dance between you. Give your hearts, but not into each other's keeping, for only the hand of life can contain your hearts. And stand together, yet not too near together, for the pillars of the temple stand apart, and the oak tree and the cypress grow not in each other's shadow." So I think 3 things come through really clearly in the message of the prophet. The vitality of life and experience, the idea of a greater or divine self, and then, of course, the romantic emphasis on following love, not convention. So we see that in the work section previously. Work is love made visible. But really, the point is, love can be work made visible if we're not, held down by the man. So Gibran didn't believe in the division between the sacred and the secular or the mundane. He didn't believe in organized religion, as we've heard, scripture or religious rituals that are something sort of set apart from life, that regulates life. He believed sort of everyday life is the ultimate reality, and it comes through in the section on religion. "Speak to us of religion," and he said, "Have I spoken this day of aught else? Is not religion all deeds and all reflection? And that which is neither deed nor reflection, but a wonder and a surprise ever springing in the soul, even when the hands of the stone, when the hands hew the stone or tend the loom. He who wears his mortality but as his best garment were better naked, and he who defines his conduct by ethics imprisons his songbird in a cage. The freer song comes not through bars and wires." So no need for clergy or a church. Remember, Gibran's earliest instincts are romantic anti-clericalism, because we have what he calls life with a capital L, the immediacy of experience. And the divine nature of everyday experience, though, has to be appreciated through a kind of spiritual awareness, a greater self connected with the universe. So in the section on houses, which is about bodies, Al-Mustafa says, "That which is boundless in you abides in the mansion of the sky, whose door is the morning mist and whose windows are the songs and the silences of night." And Kahlil Howie, he notes the influence of Emerson's notion of the oversoul on Gibran, a greater self that's connected to all the born with existence and all the other greater selves. And I think this is where some people also want to see the Sufi theme coming in. Now, Gibran himself summarized the message of the Prophet as, "You are far greater than you know, and all is well." Obviously, all does not seem well all of the time. But the idea, and this is sort of picked up on Rupi Kaur in the introduction, is that we have the capacity to understand and overcome. We can, as the dude says, abide. If you can put it all together in its grand divine context, we can abide. So Gibran's not promising health and happiness or a regime of spiritual discipline or asking you to subscribe to his podcast. He has a sense of immediacy. His message is that everything can make sense. All is well as it should be. And it comes through in this joy and sorrow section that's popular at funerals. Your joy is your sorrow unmasked. When you are sorrowful, look again in your heart and you shall see that in truth you are weeping for that which has been your delight. Some of you say joy is greater than sorrow, and others say, nay, sorrow is the greater. But I say unto you, they are inseparable. Together they come, and when one sits alone with you at your board, remember that the other is asleep upon your bed. Verily, you are suspended like scales between your sorrow and your joy. So sorrow and suffering get given a deeper sort of spiritual significance, which can be comforting, we'll see, if we change our perceptions. And this is why I think it's real popular at funerals, this section. But it can be an impediment, I think, to the kind of life Gibran would want us to live. He took a holistic approach to health, right? He was skeptical of medical science. He rejected the advice of friends to cut out the cigarettes and the arak. He felt his health problems must be deeper and more profound than mere medical science. He encourages us to place pain within the context of the deeper spiritual realities of life. He goes on to tell us to trust the physician within, but also the physician without, like your local GP, whose hands are guided by the tender hand of the unseen. Unfortunately, he didn't take his own advice and he died of cirrhosis of the liver in 1931. Now, Gibran writes a political poem in 1920. You have your Lebanon and I have my Lebanon. And when we think about the reception of the Prophet over 99 years, we can sort of suggest that it's a case of you have your Gibran and I have my Gibran, and I can identify 4 Gibrans: a populist poet, an American mystic, then Gibran the suffering subject, and the very model of the modern Middle Eastern Messiah. I'll mention the last 2 very briefly because basically I want to talk about Elvis. The biggest fan of the Prophet is the King. I take the term suffering subject from John Robbins, who theorizes this is anthropology's new focus. And what I mean here is the representation of Gibran in critical Middle Eastern studies and literary studies, focusing on his early work. I like your old stuff better than your new stuff. And on the figure of Gibran as a sort of a revolutionary figure addressing the Arab world, but also as a suffering immigrant, emphasizing his early poverty, not his popularity, or like the fact that all these wealthy women would throw money at him his whole life. So it goes with a change in academic attitude, I think, towards the representation of immigration. What matters is trying to represent struggle. And the Middle Eastern Messiah comes through, I think, sort of more official celebrations of Gibran, often funded by elements of the Lebanese diaspora, sort of depicting Gibran as an ideal Arab or ideal Lebanese because he's a kind of equal opportunity, inclusive, creative. So the idea is you can look to Gibran to at least symbolically solve some of the region's problems. So he becomes a symbol of new world success, but old world virtue. Spirituality, the recognition of Lebanese diversity, and an awareness of tradition, but not, a slave to tradition. I think these are all great things. These are all things to be celebrated. I think they're all wonderful. But we have to recognize that it's a particular reading of Gibran, and as all readings of a figure like Gibran are going to be, it's a partial reading of Gibran. I like it, but we have to be, we still have to be a bit critical of it. the idea of the populist poet, I take that line from Bushrui, who argues against it. Early critical responses to the prophet were quite negative. Reviews in The Nation and the journal Poetry criticized the mystical Eastern religious tone and the language. The review in Poetry actually said it was alien to the Western soul. It said you can hang it on the wall, but it'll never be a part of our house. And these reviews, they demonstrate a few things. Gibran was taken seriously as a poet in his lifetime, right? There were negative reviews, but they actually, they treated him as part of the serious literary world, but he's just written a really bad book. In subsequent decades, Gibran is really only present in that serious English language literary world as a kind of a populist exception. He comes to represent the antithesis of serious or academic poetry. Back in the 70s, Diane Rakowski wrote, "Don't kid yourselves, folks. There is no poetry at all outside of today's academic world, except maybe Kahlil Gibran, and who wants to be in his camp?" We could question that because we had a little cultural revolution called hip hop since then. And Dana Gioia argues that poetry is self-correcting. If it gets too obscure, too academic, then things like hip hop actually come along, or Rupi Kaur comes along to correct that. But I think the commercial success of The Prophet might be seen to establish a template in the literary world for distinction between mass popularity and critical legitimacy. So we see the return of that mockery, that mocking of popular inspirational verse in the treatment of Rupi Kaur, who I mentioned in the introduction. So I'm not arguing that Gibran is a literary genius. That's firstly, it's a subjective thing, but also we have to acknowledge the way he moved backwards against culture, was going to change the way he was interpreted. Kahlil Howie points out, The Prophet's published in 1923. 1922, T.S. Eliot publishes The Wasteland. James Joyce publishes Ulysses. So that's where the literary culture was headed, and Gibran's going back the other way. You just have to accept that's going to impact the way it's received in scholarly and critical circles. But my point is, Gibran sets a template for distinguishing the popular and inspirational from the serious. So that Gibran, the populist poet, can complement Gibran, the American mystic. Today, you find The Prophet in the New Age section of the bookstores, the well-being section of the bookstores. There's handsome editions because it's in the public domain. And it makes a really nice gift if you're looking for a gift for someone. So in 1957, The Prophet sells its 1 millionth copy, basically by word of mouth, because there was only one advertising campaign. It's popular, therefore, before the 60s get going, but between 57 and 1970, it sells 3 million more copies. In her article on The Prophet as a 1960s countercultural Bible, Brooke Walensky-Lanford recalls it as part of the hodgepodge of progressive values handed down by her ex-hippie parents, including a copy of Thoreau's Walden, which was the subject of a former lecture in this series by Alder Balthrop Lewis, which is coming soon to our YouTube channel, I am promised by our administration. The popularity of The Prophet comes partly from its use in the 60s in what Brooke Walensky-Lanford calls the footloose and scripture-free weddings that started to pop up at that time. So rather than depicting marriage as a bond, The Prophet calls it a moving sea. But because the language is formal, it's traditional, it's biblical, it gives contemporary values the air of timeless values. I think the same is true for Gibran's take on work as love and as self-expression. The Port Huron statement from 1962, one of the key statements of 60s radical politics in America, it's been described as a lazy communist manifesto. It says work should involve incentives worthier than money. And a lot of middle-class youth actually dropped out of competitive society in rebellion against this competitive values. And the back to the land movement of the 60s was completely compatible with Gibran's romantic attitude towards peasant labor. In his book, Scriptures for a Generation, What We Were Reading in the 60s, Philip Beidler calls The Prophet the ultimate 60s curio, an example of countercultural kitsch. And this is one of the really interesting aspects of The Prophet and Gibran, how common it becomes in American culture. Remember, early reviews said it was too alien for the American or the Western soul. But it became something to literally and figuratively hold on to, Beadler observes, for people living their lives as journeys. So the prophet became so much a part of American culture in the mid-20th century. It can be placed alongside peanut butter and Wonder Bread in the cultural repertoire of its biggest fan, the king, who kept a copy of the prophet on his bedside next to his golden telephone and his Bible. And we have this wonderful poem from Kieran Berry, The Death of Elvis, about, for those of you who a bit like me are experiencing post-youth, let's call it, this lip too used to curl a little easier, and we, all of us, must enter our Vegas years. How far we venture from a love of peanut butter and Wonder Bread, how far from Stutz Bearcat and Kahlil Gibran. Now, I first came across copies of the King's annotated copies of the Prophet in an exhibition at the Melbourne Immigration Museum in, I think, 2018 or maybe 2016. If you have driven your career off a cliff in a Stutz Bearcat by studying religion and popular culture for many, many years, like I have, then coming across a relic like the King's copy of the Prophet, it was a pretty special thing for me. Elvis and Gibran, I think they're kindred spirits. They both struggled with living up to the public images they created. They were trapped in what Gibran, he calls the golden chains of desire for fame. That's what keeps Gibran in New York, so he never goes back to Lebanon. He stays in New York to become famous. It's what kept Elvis in Hollywood making terrible movies. And Mary Haskell, she reported in her journals that Gibran told her the difference between a prophet and a poet is that the prophet lives what he teaches and the prophet does not. He may write wonderfully of love and yet not be loved. There's a similar revelation recounted by Naima. He recalls Gibran telling him, "I'm a false alarm." And then he observed Gibran looking at all the shady corners of his soul and considering himself a hypocrite. Now, Elvis first gets given a copy of the Prophet in 1956, which is the year he achieved superstardom. It was a source of consolation after his mother's death. That's when he puts it on his bed next to the golden throne of the Bible. We also know from biographies it was a source of intellectual stimulation. He would give away dozens and dozens of copies, which is why sometimes they end up on auction blocks. And he would quiz people, right? He asked his maid, he gave his maid a copy of the book. I mean, he asked her, "What do you think this section means?" But I want to suggest something else, that yes, it was spiritual consolation because Elvis believed in reincarnation like Gibran did. And it was a source of stimulation. But it was a source of inspiration also, a source of inspiration during his work. Those Vegas years that Kieran Berry refers to, he's doing 2 shows a night, pumped full of drugs. So he has to conceive of what he's doing as an act of love, as a form of spiritual labor, right? Not merely entertainment. And look at this. You know, work is love made visible. The king agrees. And who are you? Who are any of us to argue with the king? I mean, you know, really. So the last thing I want to say is a bit about contemporary religion, and we're still on Elvis as sort of an American mystic kind of. Gibran is an American. Well, Elvis was a spiritual seeker as well, and that's one of the reasons why I think they're sort of kin. You get the sense that I could probably talk about Elvis and Gibran all evening, but I won't. One of Gibran's best biographers, Robin Waterfield, claims Gibran as one of the founding fathers of the New Age movement. But New Age is basically, you know, a piece with theosophy, and you throw in the romantics and the emphasis on personal experience. And I think the Prophet resonates with broader, vaguer spiritual sentiments too. The dominant religious or spiritual attitudes of our time. The authority of personal experience, no higher authority than myself and my feelings. Or maybe the king, the passages in the Prophet, the king underlines that's a higher authority maybe. A universal and egalitarian understanding also of an undemanding God of no particular religion. You add to this an emphasis of well-being, and what do you have? You have 21st century religious common sense in places like Australia and America. There's a famous sociological study from the 80s, Habits of the Heart, that coined the phrase Sheilaism, a perfectly natural expression of current American religious life, just named after a nurse named Sheila. In defining my own Sheilaism, she says, it's just try to love yourself and be gentle with yourself. You know, I guess, take care of each other. I think he would want us to take care of each other. It sounds a bit like an email from university senior management. Like many others, Sheila would be willing to endorse few more specific injunctions. And there's a similar kind of British study there by Paul Hearless. He refers to spiritualities of life, teachings and practices which locate spirituality within the depths of life, the depths of subjective life, not forms of spirituality or religion which operate from beyond whatever life in this world has to offer, thereby serving as spiritualities for life. So religions that exist as sort of sacred outside to regulate life. And I think that, as Al-Mustafa says, he who defines his conduct by ethics imprisons his songbird in a cage. And so we see the emergence of what sometimes get called by sociologists post-Durkheimian forms of religion, which are not about social regulation. Now, I want to give the last word to Suhail Boushroui before we can have we've got about 15 minutes for a conversation. The last word to Suhail Boushroui, who says that the secret of the Prophet's appeal probably rests in its positive approach and its choice of words of praise rather than of criticism, raising the heart of the reader rather than putting it down. So I'm very happy to take questions or comments from the audience. I'm just going to leave this slide up here, which is my recommendations for further readings. One thing I point out is the Kahlil Gibran Collective, KahlilGibran.com, a website, which is a really fabulous resource for news and historical bits and pieces. You've got two really good biographies there, complementary ones. Waterfield focuses more on Gibran's life, Boushroui and Jenkins on his writing. And Iman Julieva, we actually have that on the ANU library database, is the best analysis of Gibran that I've read, and also Rahani and his friend Mikhail Naima as well. So thank you all, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.